What's up, everyone? Brandon here from TruckSafe Consulting. In this video, we're going to discuss the DOT short haul exemption, when it applies, what relief it affords, and what relief it doesn't afford. So stay tuned, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button below so that you can stay up to date on all of our new DOT compliance related content. So the short haul exemption that's the topic of this particular video is the one contained in Part 395 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, which of course are published by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, or the FMCSA for short. Now these rules generally apply to motor carriers and drivers who are engaged in interstate commerce, but every state in the country has adopted its own similar rules for intrastate operations. So this topic is going to be pertinent for intrastate drivers and carriers as well. You'll just need to check with your state-specific rules to see if you fall into that camp. Now, over the years, I've found that the FMCSA short haul exemption is one of the more misunderstood components of the federal safety regulations. People tend to attribute a greater weight than it's really due. So let's first talk about the scope of the exemption. In other words, from which regulations are short haul drivers really exempt? And then we'll move on to who specifically qualifies for the exemption and what happens if a short haul driver exceeds the scope of the exemption on a particular day. One of the more common misconceptions about the short haul exemption is that it's all-encompassing. In other words, if I qualify for the short haul exemption, then I or my drivers are completely exempt from all of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, including things like DOT medical examinations, hours of service limits, etc. In fact, that's just not the case. The short haul exemption is a pretty narrow one. It provides relief from only 3 specific regulatory requirements contained within the hours of service rules in Part 395. The first and most significant of these is the records of duty status, also known as the driver logging requirement. Normally, commercial drivers are required to keep track of their duty status changes, for example, driving time and on-duty not driving time, each day on a detailed graph grid log, either using paper logs or an electronic logging device. Now, this can be quite the task, particularly if the driver has several duty status changes each day. The good news is that short haul drivers are exempt from this detailed logging requirement so long as they keep daily time records that simply document the times they start and end work and the total number of hours worked each day. Now, the second rule from which short haul drivers are exempt is the electronic logging device rule. And this makes sense because the ELD requirement is just the newer, more modern means by which drivers track their duty status. Obviously, the added benefit here is that carriers and drivers who qualify for the short haul exemption won't have the expense of installing ELDs in their commercial vehicles. And lastly, short haul drivers are exempt from the 30-minute rest break requirement, which is part of the substantive hours of service restrictions, along with things like the 11-hour, 14-hour, and the 60/70-hour rules. This means that short haul drivers, at least for DOT regulatory purposes, don't have to take a rest break after accumulating 8 hours of driving time, as would any other commercial driver who is subject to the federal rules. So that's it. Those are the 3 regulations that short haul drivers don't have to worry about. Now, noticeably absent from that list are all of the driver qualification related requirements and the actual hours of service restrictions like the 11-hour driving limit. So the key takeaway here is that short haul drivers must be fully qualified under the safety regulations, and they must comply with all other regulations unless some other exemption applies. So now let's talk about who specifically qualifies for the short haul exemption. Now, prior to the end of 2020, this question was a little tougher to answer because the short haul criteria differed slightly for CDL versus non-CDL drivers. But that criteria is now uniform for both groups, and so it really comes down to this. A driver qualifies for the short haul exemption if, number 1, he or she operates solely within a 150 air mile radius of his or her normal work reporting location. 150 air miles is equivalent to about 172 statute or road miles. Number 2, he or she returns to and is released from that normal work reporting location within 14 consecutive hours. Number 3, he or she has at least 10 consecutive hours off duty for property carrying drivers or 8 hours off duty for passenger carrier drivers, separating each of those 14 hours on duty. And then lastly, the motor carrier employing that driver keeps time records for those short haul drivers, showing the times they start and end working each day and the total number of hours worked each day. Now, eligibility for the short haul exemption is considered on a driver by driver and day by day basis, meaning that if a particular driver qualifies for the exemption on Monday but not on Tuesday, well, then he's entitled to use that exemption on Monday but not on Tuesday. So in this example, the driver would be exempt from the onerous logging requirements and the 30-minute rest break requirement on Monday, but would have to comply with those rules on Tuesday. The one caveat to this is the ELD rule. Again, short-haul drivers are normally exempt from the ELD rule. And if they exceed the scope of the exemption by, for example, operating beyond the 150 air mile radius or working more than 14 hours, you'd be inclined to think that they would have to use an ELD to track their duty status on the days that they exceed the scope of that exemption. Now, that would obviously be hard and expensive to manage. So the good news is that the FMCSA built some additional allowance into the ELD rule, which says that a driver can exceed the scope of the short haul exemption up to 8 times in a rolling 30-day period, essentially 8 times in a month, before he or she would have to use an ELD to track his or her duty status. In other words, if a driver normally qualifies for the short haul exemption, but exceeds the scope of that exemption 8 or fewer times in a 30-day period, he or she can use paper graph grid logs on the days that don't qualify for the exemption, rather than using ELDs. Now, another issue that comes up pretty frequently is what happens if a driver doesn't realize they need to exceed the 150 air mile radius or the 14-hour workday until that moment's upon them. Do they lose the benefit of that exemption for that day? The answer is yes, but the FMCSA has clarified that short haul drivers must, as soon as it becomes evident to them that they will exceed the scope of the exemption, begin logging their duty status and take a 30-minute rest break if they've accumulated 8 hours of driving time. So that's it, a quick overview of the federal short haul exemption. If you're interested in a sample short haul time card or other hours of service documents or forms, make sure you check out our resource library at trucksafeconsulting.com. And if you're interested in even more in-depth discussions of the federal safety regulations, make sure you look at our comprehensive online courses at trucksafeacademy.com. As always, thanks for watching.